I'm Hannah Williamson, Content Marketing Specialist at Learning Tree International. I'm here today with Business and Organizational Psychology Consultant Robert Annis. Today we're going to talk to Robert about the remote working blog series he has recently done for Learning Tree.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. It's, first of all, a pleasure to be here. Really great to be working Learning Tree on the blog. The blog series was an interesting challenge for me to look at and think, what does the future of working look like? There's so much going on. Obviously, 2020 is a big year for everyone around the planet. There's a lot of change occurring. A chance to really stop and take stock of where we are and where we see our working lives shifting and changing, and what impact that will have for all of us, was a really interesting opportunity. And it caused me to do a lot of extra research, talk to quite a few people, and really hammer out the details of where we see the working world going. And that's what we try to encapsulate in the blog, and hopefully will be informational for anyone who wishes to read it.
Absolutely. So we're going to ask you questions about each blog. For the first one, you wrote, it was remote working is the future, but what will the future look like? Why did you pose this question? What was the impetus?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because you're sort of first of all saying, what's the future going to be like? And of course, nobody knows for certain, but there are certain things we can look at. Now, obviously, everyone's thinking about the pandemic. That's the tipping point. The coronavirus has been a defining feature of 2020. But I don't think that the pandemic is the only thing to consider. It will be something that brings other areas into sharper focus. It will force us into change, but it won't be only the pandemic being the causal factor. If we consider things like ongoing and accelerating globalization, if we think about how much technology has become part of what we're doing, more so than we could possibly imagine just 20 years ago when the internet was almost a joke, the idea that the internet could be something big. There is now, you couldn't imagine life without it in just 2 decades. Everything changing with younger populations and what they see the world looking like, very different to old generations, social political shifts around the world of work becoming more democratic, less sort of management structure, more people-led thinking. All of these things coming together allow us to really start thinking that the working future isn't the same as the working past. And really the folks at the blogs start thinking, well, what does that mean? What does that future look like?
Right, exactly. And we know and we don't know, which is exciting and scary at the same time.
Yes, indeed.
So now the second one that you went with was on the impact of the pandemic. How do you know what the impact will be?
I'd love to say I have a crystal ball, but no, of course, I don't, and nobody does. I mean, there's a lot of looking at past, looking at history and saying, where have other sort of climatic shifts happened, where have junctures happened in time, where we see something changing, there'll be a marked difference. Often it's more grey than that, and it's more of a blended change over time. But looking at the past gives us ideas. Also, I do a lot of research through the job that I have. I work with a lot of clients and see what they're doing, what's working, what isn't working, as I help to advise them in the work I've done, well, globally, really. And then on top of all that, I spend a lot of time studying psychology. Right now I'm working through my master's in organizational behavioral psychology. And all these things that are coming together are helping, I mean, not just me, but loads of other people, of course, looking at what we're going through and what we're likely to do coming out of it, seeing how organizations are shifting at the moment with all the situations of the pandemic and the other things I've just mentioned in the answer to the previous question. How those organizations are shifting to work differently, whether it be where companies have said people can now work from home indefinitely, or they're turning around and trying different numbers of working hours per week. These are massive shifts that you might normally see once in every few generations. And we're seeing all of them suddenly happening right now. And that does cause us to look and say, well, what is the impact of this pandemic and all the other factors going to be long term?
Yeah, absolutely. And so then the next blog kind of went into, those quick changes, like you said, we're dealing with all of those all at once. And it was on a day in the life of a post-pandemic worker. So how do you think that this will impact the average worker or leader?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, we often look at big overall trends and we sort of say, oh, 20 years from now, China will be the biggest economic power, overtake US or something like that, right? Big global trends. And those are, generally speaking, you can look at historical data and you can predict stuff like that. I wouldn't say easily, but, with some sense of likelihood. But sometimes predicting what will happen to a more singular fact, because you're talking about more like a single data point, if you like, what will change for each individual person down on the street? What's their life going to be like? And this is an interesting one to think about, try and pitch what this means, whether you're a leader or a worker. It really does look to sort of think, well, what does it mean? If we're talking about things like the pandemic and things, it's going to have to increase freedom and trust. We're going to have to learn to trust our people if we're not as close to them, right? But they're also going to have to learn themselves how to use that freedom. If you're used to working in certain ways and being guided and having more structure, and you suddenly lose that, for some workers, that's quite hard. So some of the shifts can be quite different. I think there's opportunities for growth in both of these areas. And of course, it's different for every person, for every organization, which is also part of the challenge. An organization can't turn around and say, for all of our people, this is what we're going to do, right? Some people just won't be able to work from home, whether it's their home working environment just isn't conducive to it, or they're just mentally not set up for it. They just can't do that. It really does depend. For other people, it's ideal, right? If you're very much an introvert, maybe that's great for you. If you're an extrovert, it could be really, really hard, and you'll really miss those interactions. So there's no one size fits all, and it's really just starting to think about the flexibility that you need to have to match that freedom and trust. And I think for all organizations, this will become a key differentiator and a key thing to consider, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like you were saying, it affects different people differently, and that includes roles. And the next blog you wrote was specifically on leadership in remote working organizations. Do you really think that people and these leaders will change?
It's a great question. And I think there's some sort of question of whether you're a positive or negative person. Do you see people who are given a challenge and think they'll rise to it or not? I tend to think people do rise to a challenge. We do tend to see that when we're put in a difficult situation, people do tend to step up and impress us and themselves. I'm never going to turn around and just say, oh, certain people can't do this, right? I'd never, darken the doorstep of any group of people. I don't want to generalize. But at the same time, I think it's an opportunity. I really, really do. I think this is a chance for whatever level you're at in an organization, that these problems will be seen in the future, looking backwards with hindsight, as a time of great opportunity. As we shift to different ways of working, we're going to see these things as big opportunities. To use very specific examples, in the world of project management, which is almost every organization around the world, they do projects of some sort, and they've used project management types for decades, which have been largely the same, haven't changed that much. In the last decade or so, there's been a shift to more agile ways of working, no doubt about it, but most companies are still very much living projects in a standard sort of way, going through the phased approaches. But you're starting to see that shift, and not shift a little bit, but shift massively. The easiest example I can think of is to go big, right? If in doubt, gamble. The largest project of all time is the US fighter aircraft program to build the F-35. Biggest budget of any project ever. Some estimates around $250 billion. And you look at them and what they managed to do in the project, because it's so essential to get the product out there, is that they've broken the idea in the project in just doing phases. So they actually started releasing the product, the planes themselves, to the air forces around the world whilst they're still in development. And now what they're doing is doing what's called concurrent delivery. And so as they're delivering planes, those planes can't actually do all the functionality they need to do. They can do some of them. So air forces start using those planes, and then later on, those planes get upgrades. And that would have been seen to, 15 years ago, to have been impossible. You could have gone to almost any organization and say, could you deliver the product while it's still in development before you've even finished testing? Most organizations would say, no, it's not possible. You can't do it. Yet the largest project in the world just did. And so these shifts that we're going to see in organizations, a lot of it's going to be, can these organizations enable themselves to believe they can make these shifts? For them to survive in this post-pandemic world with greater technology, greater globalization, all these kinds of things, it's going to be a question of saying, let's look at what we have and how we've done things. Are we able and willing to change some of the very DNA, some of the very core concepts of how we work? And that would be a big, big challenge for organizations. It'll be interesting to see who survives it.
Absolutely. And the next one kind of goes into that as well. And it was on organizational policy changes and shifts. So the question is, do you think that organizations will really change their policies due to this pandemic?
Yeah, I think they're really going to have to. I think all of these things come together and really connect into the next reality. Really, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and things like that, as people use a sort of a key phrase at the moment. And these sort of ideas really do come to a fore. And I think that these organizations, which is all of us, we don't live in bubbles. We do live in a situation where we are impacted by others, whether it's, people be able to see what other companies can and can't do and how good they are through their products or through reviews on Glassdoor or whatever it may be. I think it's hard to say that organizations won't have to face some of this. And I think it will be a bit like the Blockbusters of this world and the Circuit Cities and other companies around the world that we don't see anymore, M1s, etc. Northern Rock in the UK, and different companies like that at one point were mainstays, that were standards that you saw everywhere. And the lesson here really is the past certainly informs the future, but it doesn't define it. Just because companies exist right now, there's no guarantee they'll exist in a few years. BP, British Petroleum, they recently just sold off a huge amount of their oil finding kit, in fact, entire departments, because they've turned around and said, we know the future isn't oil, we know the future is green, and so we're doubling down on the future organization being focused in that way. If you'd said that to most people a few years ago, BP would do that, that's their core business, right? And that's the point of organizations and how they have to see the world, is that the world's shifting and it changes, and to survive, to be successful, you have to also shift. And that exists outside your company with how you're seen, as well as your internal organizational policies, as we see now with Me Too and Black Lives Matter. The world is constantly shifting and growing and maturing, and we have to react to that.
Right, exactly. They have to be able to grow with the changes.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last blog that you wrote, which is, of course, had to be in this, is technology of the remote worker. Because as you were saying before, not everyone can work from home, or there's different problems. So anything you wish to add about this blog?
Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, this was the hardest blog of them all to write, probably because it's the simplest. It's the one that everyone was expecting. The series, which I did as the last one. A lot of the comments I've had back after people reading these blogs, I think perhaps looking for what they find comfortable. The comments, the views, some of the stuff's coming back already has been about the technology. It's about sort of which program do you think is best? Do you think Skype is better than one of its other competitors, Zoom or whatever, right? They all have their places, all useful. I'm not saying they're not, they're essential. I mean, look at us doing this interview. The technology is essential. You're in the US, I'm in the UK. These things are obviously very, very important. But it's too easy to say that the main focus for the future of working, of remote working, for example, is the technology, the software and hardware and so on. Of course, they're important. I'm not saying they aren't. If you don't have a webcam, that's probably something that needs to be fixed. But it shouldn't reduce the focus on everything else we've talked about already, on the real shifts and changes in psychology and sociology, of the interactions, of the shifts in responsibility. All these things will be so important. Quite simply, is a webcam an enabler? Yes, but it won't change any of the other problems. It won't change the fact of people not having enough interactions or not being able to sit down and talk face to face. It improves things massively over email. Of course, that goes without saying. But organizations mustn't just focus on the technology. I have one client who, obviously, I can't mention who they were, but they invested millions and millions in all this technology long before the pandemic. It was a move to say we want to have everyone have a webcam and everyone have that ability to work from home, and all the meeting rooms will have active webcam tracking and all really cool kit. It was very impressive. For the first couple of months, outstanding success. Very soon after that, they found that people stopped using them. And what they hadn't really addressed was anything more than just technology. They hadn't addressed really how people used it, what its benefits were, really the psychology of what it's there for. So I guess the lesson of the last blog is, of course, I hope the information I put in there is useful, but please don't ignore the other blogs and their focus. Hopefully the intention is to take all of them holistically.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking about with us about the series today. They're all on Learning Tree's site, and keep a lookout for the ebook so you can easily read all of them. I will say, Robert and I discussed the order, and so maybe take that and read it in order to get the full grasp, as he's saying. And also keep a lookout for more blogs from Robert. And thank you. Thank you so much for doing this chat with me.
My pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And as you said, I look forward to doing many more. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.